We go. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Rockpile Museum. It's nice to see some familiar faces out tonight. Thanks for joining us. This evening, we have a special guest with us, Mr. Lee Silliman, who is the curator of Hurrah for the Cowboy, the exhibit behind me in our gallery space. We've been pleased to have this exhibit with us for most of 2024. It's been quite popular because it is very well done. A great exhibit that really tells the story of the American Cowboy, which you'll hear about tonight. The artwork is wonderful, of course, the quotes. So thank you, Lee, for sharing the exhibit with us. I want to tell you a little bit about Lee before we get going here. One more thing before we do that, upcoming events. We do have a Veterans Tour on November 11th, Veterans Day. Mr. Greg Bennick is going to lead a tour through Mount Pisgah Cemetery and tell the stories of some of our local veterans that are buried up there. So join us for that. That's 2 p.m. on the 11th. So that is immediately following the parade. The parade's at 1 o'clock. So join us for that. And then on December 5th, we have our Repeal Day celebration, celebrating the repeal of Prohibition. So what more fun can we do than celebrate that little bit of history? Our special guest that night is Amber Pollock from Backwards Distilling in Casper, and she's going to teach us about some of the recipes that really came out of Prohibition, what that whole affair caused, how people reacted to that, and what they started making with moonshine and bathtub gin and all the fun things they were making. So that should be a lot of fun. So come out for that one. And then, of course, Christmas crafts is coming up. So if you have kids or grandkids that are interested, please stay tuned. Registration will be in November for Christmas crafts. All right, Lee Silliman is a retired educator and former museum archivist, now living in Missoula. He has nurtured an avid interest in the art and history of the American West since his youth. As a collector of vintage engravings, Silliman has assembled and annotated many exhibits of these artworks for museums in 6 Western states. He has taught 5 courses for the Molly program at the University of Montana on Western history and art. And tonight he's going to give us a brief history of the American Cowboy.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. Is my microphone working for all of you? And I was a school teacher for 43 years, so I've learned to speak loud so they don't fall asleep. So we'll get going here. But before I do that, I want to compliment Robert and Justin and Heather and other staff members at the museum. They've made me feel so welcome. They've helped me get everything ready, including some last-minute emergencies. They've done a fabulous job of hanging and displaying my show there. And so I want to give them a public acknowledgement of how helpful and how good they are at putting my products up for a beautiful display, especially the artifacts that they put in the display along with my 2-dimensional art. So if you haven't been into the gallery after the program, be sure you go there, or if you want to see go it again, please do it. All right, let's look at what we're going to talk about tonight. The cowboy culture actually originated further south in Spanish-speaking countries, Mexico and further south, and we're going to learn how that was brought into the American Southwest. We're then going to look at the post-Civil War expansion of the cattle industry, although it had actually had flourished before the Civil War briefly. That's kind of the most heroic and most spectacular point. The post-Civil War days, which included the trail drives, because of the pent-up demand in the country, was pulling the millions of cattle that were not harvested during the Civil War. And those trail drives were a special epic time for about 20 or 30 years in the West. We're going to talk about ranch life once ranches became established, how the cowboys operated when they were based at ranches instead of on trail drives from the South to the Northern territories. We're going to look at the unfortunate winter of 1886-87 and what that did, and finally end up with a brief shout out to the cowboy mythology and ethos. Let's look at the Hispanic origins The Spanish people were the ones who brought the horse and the cattle to the Americas. For those of you that missed my lecture at noon today, the horse was actually evolved over 50 million years in North America, and it spread across the Bering Land Bridge when the ocean levels were much lower than they are today into Asia and Europe. But the Spanish brought the horse actually disappeared 10,000 years ago in North America. So the Spanish, when they started colonizing first the Caribbean islands and then into Mexico and Central and South America, they brought cattle with them and horses. So as you probably have learned in your history books, that in the early 1800s, Spanish-speaking people were occupying and colonizing the landmass that you see there in the kind of the pink type colors. So that was like Spanish territory and culture during that whole time. And as you, I'm sure know, the upper half of that was ceded to the United States in the war with Mexico. We'll look at that in perhaps later. So here we have some beautiful artwork. You know, if should be no surprise to you that the collections I have of the beautiful artwork on display there are just a small number of what I own. And I also have a lot of books, and I study artists all throughout the time point or the time period and the expansion of the West. So I've pulled a lot of pictures that illustrate my talking points off the internet is to make these seem very colorful and real. So here come the the cattle off the boats, and they originally began building up their herds in Mexico, and then the cattle industry spread further north during Spanish rule in what they called New Spain. Most, in particular, ocean travel was more feasible than traveling through the deserts and dry country of the Southwest. So there were a lot of ships, Spanish ships, going up and down the Mexican coast and up into California. In fact, California was called Upper Mexico back in that time. Alta California means northern Spanish territory. They put a lot of Spanish missions, and the missions had large cattle herds. And so you had to have cowboys who learned how to handle the cattle that were surrounding these missions, because there were hundreds of people at these missions and they needed a lot of meat. So they had a lot of cattle around these Spanish missions. And so the Spanish developed their own style of handling the cattle. Well, Mexico became independent from Spain in 1821, just in the same way that we became independent from England, you know, in 1776. And so you have this territory then that is run by the country of Mexico. The Mexican government was relatively weak compared to, say, the Spanish government. And they made the decision, they probably regretted it, of issuing land grants to European Americans coming westward. They were allowed to establish like big communities, like John Sutter's Fort, where these English-speaking people had the right to put up these establishments, and they raised cattle and had cowboys and so on. You might know something special about Sutter's Fort. You all know what happened at Sutter's Fort in about 1848, the discovery of gold in California. So you had a lot of Anglos coming into Alta California, or what is today the state of California. Am I still good? Okay. And the war with Mexico then was a turning point. As you all, here's a picture of some of the important battles. And as you all know, the Americans defeated the Mexican army in the war. And so the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave land in 10 present states. You know, when I prepared this slide lecture, I was amazed to find that we all knew that, you know, Texas and California and Arizona and New Mexico came with the treaty from Mexico. But look at these portions. There's some of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Colorado, and even Wyoming was part of the land that we grabbed from the Mexican government as a result of the war with Mexico. So we got a lot of land from them. So I think I've laid the basis for the idea that handling cattle from the back of a horse really originated from further south. It's of Spanish origin, and it worked its way northward. And so when we became, the American government became the owner of that lands, we took over the methodology of handling the cattle and gave our own spin to it. I like to put up pictures of Charlie Russell. In fact, you can almost say that Charlie Russell is why I'm standing here in front of you. Just a little tangent. When I was in college, for fun from physics and chemistry and mathematics, I would go to the art library and I would study Charlie Russell and Frederick Remington books. And I wanted to live out west. I'm a graduate of the University of Illinois, and so we moved out here in 1969. And I've always loved Charlie Russell's artwork. So I always love to take advantage when I'm giving programs of throwing in Charlie Russell's art. But here's a picture of Spanish vaqueros. That was the Spanish name for the Spanish cowboy. And one of the traits of the Spanish cattle was their long horns and their wildness. Quite often, these longhorns would escape control and they would become feral, and they were very dangerous. In the readings that I've been able to focus on, if you were caught afoot out in the wilds and there was a longhorn steer, your life could be at risk. You better look for a tree or something to hide behind, because these longhorns were about as bad as the grizzly bear sometime. Like, for example, this Frederick Remington picture shows that when you're not mounted on a horse and there's a longhorn steer there that you've grieved and he wants to go after you, you're in trouble. All right, here's a fascinating list of the words on the left that we're very familiar with, and you can see they are all derivatives of Spanish words, chaps from chaparreras and so on. I better not try to pronounce those Spanish words. I've got two reasons. First of all, I took 4 years of French. Parlez-vous en français is about half of what I remember, and so I better not try to pronounce any of those. Isn't that interesting how the American versions were derivatives of the Spanish words for all of those cowboy terms? Isn't that interesting? So again, I think I've established the idea that the cowboy culture drifted northward with Spanish roots, as this artist is showing here. And the Spanish and Mexican cowboys, to protect their herds, were very willing to make war upon the grizzly bears. I've studied the history of the grizzly bear. In fact, that's one of my next projects. I already have a very fine collection of grizzly bear images from 1828 to 1943 that I'm developing into my next traveling exhibit. There were 10,000 grizzly bears in the present state of California. And that was the high water mark, because as the cattle industry moved northward from Mexico into present day California, they made war on the grizzly bear. They would lasso them and drag them to death or shoot them. Sometimes they would even make spectacles out of them, as you'll see here shortly. Here's another engraving that I was able to purchase showing some 6 vaqueros. Yeah, there's 6 there, who are roping a grizzly bear. You know, I would say the first cowboy to lasso a grizzly bear is the bravest one. You better hope his compatriots get a rope in the other direction. I mean, you know, you want to reel in a grizzly bear? No, so you better have a lot of expert ropers with you if you're going to play that sport. Not only did they kill the grizzly bears because they were preying on their cattle, they made a spectacle. You all heard of the bull fights that were famous in Spanish culture in Mexico. Uh, well, this was an American version. You get a live grizzly bear and a longhorn, turn them loose and see who's going to win the battle. And this blood sport was fairly popular in the beginning, but it eventually died out. The Anglos were less enthused about that. There are a number of newspaper accounts of how exciting it was to watch a grizzly bear and a longhorn fight it out. And I would say it was 50-50. Sometimes the bear won and sometimes the steer won because each had a weapon the other didn't have. The grizzly bears had tremendous power with their claws and their, and obviously the longhorns had their horns that could put a very serious hole in you. So it was a 50-50 proposition. If you take a look at this map, here is the movement of cattle prior to the Civil War. I didn't realize this, but when gold was discovered in 1848 and the 49ers came rushing in, there were tens of thousands of people coming to the gold fields of California, and they needed a lot of food. So cattle were moved not only from Mexico up into it, but there were cattle driven westward. You're all familiar with the cattle drives going north, which we'll discuss later in the program, but the first cattle drives were north from Mexico into California or westward into California from eastern points. So I think I've again made it clear about the roots of the cowboy culture. I want you to pay attention to Edward Borin's paintings. I think he is an artist who is, I hate to say as good as Charlie Russell because I think he's the very best Western artist, but Edward Borin I think is almost as good as Charlie Russell. He was a cowboy and he developed a very, very fine way of creating pictures of cowboys, especially in the watercolor medium. So you're going to see a number of Ed Borin pictures in this slide program. I would encourage you to come up afterwards and look at the books I have up here on the history of the cowboy. This particular book is right here, and it's really about the cowboys throughout all of the Americas. We think of cowboy culture as the American West. Well, it was very significant in Central America and in South America. And this book does an excellent job of really showing how it was a hemispherical movement, not just a local Western American one. And I've got some other books up here on the American Cowboy that I would encourage you to come and look at from my collection. And this is just a small number. I only have room for 2 boxes. I also have a bibliography of what I consider some of the more interesting books on the history of the cowboy. And you're welcome to take a copy and either find a library that has them or go to ABE Books and buy a copy. So let's look at the post-Civil War expansion. These were the bonanza days because of the pent-up demand of lots of people after the war wanting to get back to a normal life. And there were large numbers of cattle that were unattended or had gone feral, especially across the Mississippi River. You know, Texas was part of the Confederacy, and most Texans were busy fighting, not herding cattle. So there was a large number of them. You do know, of course, that buffalo were the main herbivore of the American West. There were up to 40 or 50 million of them that Native people lived on. And of course, as the buffalo were massacred, the cattle took their place on especially the high plains. There were people that took trains out west and were killing buffalo off from trains. But the significant numbers of bison were killed by market hunters. There were some chemists on the East Coast who figured out a very economical way of turning buffalo hides, tanning them and make them into belts. And during the late 1800s, a lot of factories used buffalo hide belts to transfer power from one wheel to another wheel, gearing them up and down. So a lot of Eastern factories used buffalo hide for their belts, and that's what drove the massacre of the buffalo and the use of their hides. Far more than just blankets. They stripped the fur off of them, both of them. So replacing the buffalo were the cattle that you see in this picture. And these are, the Longhorn was one of the first ones, and other breeds were brought in. So this just again replicates what I was saying, that the post-Civil War was the time when things really took off for cattle herding in the West. Up on the upper right, that's a fairly rare photograph because there weren't very many photographers taking pictures of the Longhorns, so that's kind of a rare one. Well, the very first cattle drive was in 1866 that went up to Sedalia, Missouri, a town which I've driven through a number of times. Again, notice this beautiful Ed Vereen picture here. 168,000 in the first year or so. So as the railroads expanded westward, as you can see with the red lines there in that slide, the green lines show the trails that developed to push the cattle up to meet the railroads, who would then ship the cattle either live or dressed out to eastern markets in the Midwest and to the East Coast. And so that is, I think, a really good illustration. Here's four famous trails: the Goodnight Loving Trail, the Western Trail, the Chisholm Trail, and the Sedalia Trail. Now, you might think that, the trail was, take that word literally, and you shouldn't do that. The trail was not like one pathway that they all followed. It was a general area. For one thing, the cattle would be disturbing the ground and eating, they can only go about 10 miles or a dozen miles a day or 15 or so, and they bed down. So you're eating a lot of grass. So these trails were really very wide stretches. They might be 25, 50 miles wide. So it's just a general area because they couldn't all just follow one after another because of the need for grass. But it was important. I'm proud of this picture. A copy of this is in my show behind me here. This is the first published illustration. It was done in 1867 of the cattle drive. So it started very early, right after the Civil War. And here's another very early newspaper publication from Frank Leslie's, showing them when you get to the railheads, they had to load them into the rail cars. I want you to notice, this is my first illustration. You might have thought that the cattle shout was that's not a typographical error. That's how they thought a chute was to be spelled. So I had to put that in, driving them up the cattle chutes into the cars there. Problems. The Texas cattle fever, which is spread by a tick, was a very deadly disease, and the people in Missouri didn't want the Longhorns coming north through their territory and bringing this disease. So there was actually some resistance against driving cattle northward into Missouri at one time. So that was a problem that confronted these. And here was one of the largest destinations of the cattle that once they hit the railroads shifted to the east, and Chicago developed as one of the major stockyards distribution points. If you look carefully at the data here, you'll see that in the beginning, they were shipping live cattle on the railroads, but that's a lot of weight that's not useful. When you dress out a cow, what do you get? Less than 50% meat from the hoof weight. And so when they started developing refrigerated cars, and I'm sure they were using blocks of ice at that time, refrigerated cars. So as they developed refrigerator cars, that began transporting more beef to the east, and then the live cattle numbers dropped because why ship the weight of all of the cow when only half of it's going to be used at its destination. You'll notice here that this is a picture of what is today Oklahoma. It is where Native people were pushed westward from the east. And Native people, how should we say this? The cattle drives were going across their land and eating a lot of their grass. And so it was right that they expected to receive some compensation. So it was generally agreed that a lot of the cattle drives would have to pay the native tribe that lands they were crossing for permission. They would cut out, sometimes it was with money, but most likely it was, 10 or 20 steers from the herd you give to this tribe for permission to cross their land. And that was fair. So that's what Charlie Russell was trying to indicate here. Going across our land, you have to pay us. I find this a very interesting picture. As a kid, and I see a lot of you out here with gray hair like me, when you were a kid, you might have played cowboy and Indian. Actually, that's kind of a misnomer. Maybe it was generated by the TV shows we were watching when we were kids in the 50s, but there were relatively few armed conflicts, lethal conflicts between cowboys and Indians. By the time the cattle era was spreading into the West, the Native people have been pushed onto reservations. And so there were very few lethal encounters between cowboys and Indians. But it makes for great art and great stories and drama. So I think it is a misnomer. And you'll notice this was a German publication. Germans and French and English people were very fascinated with the West. So anything they could get their hands on, word or pictures, they loved the stories. When I first saw this picture, I thought those Indians were trying to steal those cattle. Turns out I was wrong. These were Native people who were hired as cowboys to manage some of the cattle on the trail drives and especially in some of the ranches. So they're actually herding them because there's a story associated with this. They're not trying to steal them. They're just part of the cowboy culture that's herding them. In fact, there's a whole book called When Indians Became Cowboys because they basically were transforming their skills at hunting buffalo into herding cattle. And I've got the copy right up here if you'd like to look at it. But that's a whole subject that I knew nothing about until I started delving into the history, that Native people developed a lot of abilities as a cowboy. This was a very influential book published in 1881 because as the cattle herds began filling up the Western territories, going further and further north, people were making a lot of money by pushing the cattle onto the free open range before the homesteaders had closed it up, and then shipping it, selling it and shipping the beef to the eastern markets. You could make tremendously high profits in the cattle industry. And so here is a book that promised an annual return of 25% on an investment of money. Raise your hand if you found 25% interest in any bank or investment lately. You can see how this really drove people to invest more and more into the cattle industry. So a lot of money poured into the Western territories, especially from England in particular. They spent a lot of money expanding the cattle industry in the early 1880s. The quote, free range had a problem that was enunciated very well by an author, I think it was a middle 20th century author named Garrett Hardin. It's called The Tragedy of the Commons. If you have something that everybody can enjoy and nobody owns, everybody thinks, well, let's use it. But the more and more you use it, the more it can become degraded. You know, if you pump more and more cattle, millions and millions of more cattle into the open free range, eventually you eat up too much grass and, you know, the ecosystem can collapse. It was no surprise then that as more and more cattle came into the free range and everybody could profit from it without paying for it, that eventually something would have to give. And as we'll see pretty soon here, Mother Nature dealt the blow that knocked some sense into them. It says here that the cattle drives peaked in 1871. 700,000 cattle were driven into Kansas. So again, here is a map showing how far north they went up into, you know, although the railroads were situated in Nebraska and Kansas, the free range was up into the Northern Territories. And even by 1890, these red lines show how the rail lines were expanding rapidly into the Western Territories. And so by the 1890s, the cattle drives were unnecessary for a very long distance. You just would go to the nearest railroad. So that cattle drive era was a fairly short one of a few decades long. It's like so much as technology and progress advances, economies change, processes change. One historian estimated that 30,000 men during that trail driving period trailed 8 million cattle northward. Again, another beautiful picture by Ed Bereen. And this picture is actually a really neat Frederick Remington one in my exhibit here. It's on the wall behind me. And before I forget, if you've seen everything in that room, we've got 3 more of my pictures on the other side of the green wall right here. So if you're going to see the whole show, you got to go around the corner there. The glory days. All right, let's look at the cattle drive. There were important roles to play by various characters. First of all, you had the trail boss. He had to know the general direction. He was responsible for the whole process. He was the captain of the ship, so to speak. What other important players do you have? Well, you better have a chuck wagon going out ahead of you, finding the wood and water, the place where you're going to feed everybody at night. They had to do that in a very responsible way under the direction of the trail boss. The cowboys that were most senior and advanced were the point men. You have the swing men in the middle of the herd. The flank was the people in the lower totem pole of the cowboy strata. And then you have the drags who get to eat all the dust. And we got some really neat pictures and paintings showing this process. That whole caravan then, as I said, could go maybe 10 or 15 miles in a day. Here is a picture by Ed Bereen showing you need to have a really good lead cow, usually a female cow, because if they were followed by the rest of the herd. There's always a hierarchy in most animal cultures, and so you need to pick a good, trustworthy leader at the head of it. There's the trail boss. Oh, oops, I went a little too fast. He was the man where all the responsibility rested to make sure the process went good. And here you are with the point riders in the front. And then you're, again, another point rider. And then here are your flank riders. if you're very knowledgeable about Charlie Russell, don't you think Edward Bereen is a good competitor? They were friends, actually. They knew each other. But I have increased my admiration enormously for that artist. He doesn't have the renown that Charlie Russell does, but I think he was just as good at painting the cowboy, although we call Charlie the cowboy artist. If any cow tries to break away, your flank riders have to bring them back into the herd. If calves were born along the trail, they couldn't keep up. They either were killed or they gave it away to somebody or put it in a wagon. You couldn't slow down the movement of the whole herd because of a new calf being born. And theoretically, I picked that picture because I'm pretending that there's a calf up here somewhere. We can pretend, can't we? Yeah. Okay. The drags, they get to be in the rear end, making sure there's no cow that stays behind, and they get to eat the dust, and that's where the bandana was most useful. So it wasn't just something for bank robbers. I mean, you had to do that. I'm supposed in the audience we had some people out there who've had to use bandanas. And here's some photographs showing by Erwin Smith how bad it can be at the trail end, with a couple thousand cattle kicking up dust and you have to eat it all day after day. No fun. The night wranglers, every cowboy in a day's time might have needed 3 or 4 or 5 other mounts, they had to change. And so you had to have a wrangler bring the horse herd along and take care of it. So that was his job too. And maybe sometimes they put up a rope corral. Sometimes it was just the night wranglers had to keep the wranglers had to keep circling around the horse herd to keep them under control. And at night, when the cattle were bedded down, you had to have the night herders, and each of the cowboys got a 2-hour shift. And so these night times, when you wanted the cattle to settle down, that's where the idea of the cowboy serenade began. They would sing to the cows, supposedly. I have other narratives that say they didn't do that, but some cowboy narratives say that it was really kind of soothing at night to generally sing a lullaby as you were riding around the cattle as they bedded down at night. Yeah. The only person exempted from night herding was the cook because his job was very demanding. The others had to be awakened at various times in the night. And so here's a really neat Frederick Remington painting called In from the Night Herd. Can you see him kicking his replacement? Get up, my time to sleep is here and your time to go night herding it's nigh. I like this. Long days in the saddle and 2 hours of night guard. You get really tired. The boss says, you can sleep next winter. I thought that was a good retort. Because the trail drives could last for months, many weeks up into several months. The cowboys were very solicitous of the chuck wagon and making sure that the chuck wagon never broke down or never got bogged down, because you wanted to make sure there was going to be good food for you at the end of the day and in the early morning. One of the dangers was crossing waters because of the danger of drowning, both the animals and or the cowboys. So that became really important that you pick a good lead cow. Remember we were talking about the lead cow. Also had to be a good swimmer, one not afraid to enter the water and get the other cattle to follow it, because you didn't want a rebellion at the edge of a stream. You wanted them to follow the lead cow across. So that was very important to find a lead cow to break into a stream, because there's a natural tendency for animals not to want to enter water at times. At least some of them can have that frame. You don't want to have cattle starting a mill in the stream, because if they refuse to get off on the far side by going into a milling, they're going to be swept downstream and drowned. And no trail boss wants to report to the owner that we lost dozens of cattle, drowning in a river crossing. So again, here's another Aaron Smith picture of a real crossing, the Canadian River down in Texas. Every cowboy feared a stampede, whether it was in the day or the night. It was a very dangerous affair. As you can see, that cowboy on the right is going to be in trouble with his horse stumbling. Do you notice that perhaps he stumbled on some prairie dog holes? This is the origin of why cowboys hate prairie dogs, is because if your horse is running very fast and puts a leg into a prairie dog hole, the horse goes down, the man goes down, the horse's leg is broken, the horse is no good anymore. So stampedes are very much feared by the cowboy. And here's Frederick Remington's depiction of what happened when you encounter a prairie dog town during a stampede. Stampedes can happen for any reason. And the way you counter them is to, just like in a stream crossing, if they're starting to go into go somewhere where you don't want them, you turn them into around on each other and get them to circle instead of running straight. So every cowboy encountering a stampede would be trying to turn them into away from a straight line pathway out. Nighttime was the worst. How would you like to be one of the night wranglers and have a night lightning storm, rile the cattle up and get them running off? And it's your job to get them under control. It was their worst nightmare. I have this example here in the exhibit of a stampede of cattle in Texas. Very graphic illustration of what you don't want to be a part of. Just out, if you're curious to know, this is a very rare picture, and it was on the internet for $150 for several years, and I refused to pay that amount of money until I decided I was going to put this show together. So I paid $150 for that one. And there's several Charlie Russell pictures in the show that I paid $150 for. So they're very rare. I've never seen another copy of this. Death of a hero. His horse went down in a stampede. And here's a true story painted by Charlie Russell. He knew the people that were involved in this stampede. Charlie Russell was a night wrangler. He was not a full-fledged cowboy. He was a point man or a flank man. He took care of the horse herd at night, and but he knew all the people intimately in the cowboy culture, and he knew of a man who was killed in a night stampede. So he did this picture. Ed Barine, tonight there is no wagons, and we have not had anything to eat and have no blankets. It is so cold the men can hardly stand it. Had a short stampede. It rained and snowed a little. If you think cowboy life was a lot of fun, the real life experience was not always fun, as Mr. Barine illustrates here. So what happens after the cattle drive and you get paid off? You want to go have some fun. So the cattle towns were often the scene of painting the town red. I've got this picture in the exhibit. They were notorious for riding their horses through town and shooting their guns, and perhaps even riding into a saloon. Again, this is a picture in the exhibit, cowpunchers shooting up a saloon. In spite of all the hardships, men looking back upon those experiences considered them the glory days. They were times which tested their endurance, their courage, their camaraderie. If you could manage to hold up your end of the responsibilities for on a trail drive, it was something to be very proud of. And so there are a number of books relating those stories. In fact, there was a whole like association of trail drive survivors that formed in Texas. I don't know that I don't think it's in existence now, but into the early 1900s, they had these annual conventions of the men that had participated in the trail drives. Ranch life. So, the trail drives is one thing, but ranches that had cattle had their own ethos. So let's look at the fun you could have, quote, unquote, on a cattle ranch. First of all, you had to contend with horses that didn't care to cooperate with you. Like here's one learning his first lesson, his first time he's had a saddle put on him. I'm sure there are people in the audience who know all about how much fun it is to bend the will of a horse to your desires. It took a lot of work and training to get the horse under your control, and it didn't always end up pleasantly. I've never been bucked off, but I've talked to some people and say it's no fun. I've only been on a horse about 3 or 4 times. Remember I told you I was a historian, not a cowboy. Where the coyotes howl and the wind blows free, they buried him there on the lone prairie. There were a number of cowboys that did not survive their employment. L.A. Huffman was a Montana photographer. Those are Montana scenes. So the cowboy had to learn to stay on board, and that, of course, led to some of to handle the cattle. That led to the idea of the rodeo. A demonstration of the traits that you need to hone and perfect when you're out doing your job, but doing this for an audience. And so, well-broken horses were the result of a lot of hard work. And Maynard Dixon, who is a 20th century artist that I hold in high regard, spent some time in his illustration days on some ranches, and he did some very fine paintings of cowboy and ranch life, and I've got a few of them in the exhibit. So pay attention to the names of some of the artists there. I've got several really good pictures. Don't you think he's really painting horse flesh pretty well there? The horses certainly don't like to cooperate in the morning if they can get away with avoiding the loop. Cowboy life wasn't very glorious when you look at some of the accommodations that they had to live in. They're fairly primitive, small quarters. If you'd like to see a remnant of it, go to Deer Lodge, where I used to live. There's the Grand Cours Ranch, and they have a bunkhouse row. You were in close proximity to your fellow workers. You had very little space. It was not a high-paying job, but it was a job that many people relished because of the fresh air and the demonstration of their skills and just the whole ethos of it. So quite often from when ranches were established, they would turn their cattle loose to roam on the free range, and then they'd have to be rounded up usually twice, once in the spring and once in the fall. And they'd have what was called a roundup, where you would get a number of representatives from the various cattle ranches in the area, say like in the Judith Basin where I used to live in Denton. And they would go out and round up all of the cattle that had spread all over the terrain, get them together and brand the new calves and separate the ones that are going to go to market. So the roundup was a time of great drama, and you needed to have really good horses, a so-called cutting horse, the one that knew how to read the intention of the cowboys to which cow you're going to go after and get them under control and get them to do what you want. So a really good cutting horse was highly valued. But again, lots of horses don't want to cooperate all the time. So we've got some really neat pictures of Charlie Russell that he did. The The trail boss would scatter the riders every morning. You know, you go out, Pete, you go out in that draw, and Sam, you go over into this coulee, and Bill, you head up into the foothills over here to bring them together. That's what Charlie Russell was showing there. And again, an Edward Marine painter of the same thing, scattering the riders to make sure they were able to round up all the strays, get them into that roundup area. Have I convinced you that Edward Marine is a good artist of the cowboy? I'm curious, how many of you have ever heard of Ed Marine before? With one. See, you're learning tonight. But of course, Charlie Russell was a master at it. He was able to, I think, make such dramatic imagery. A slick ear is because when the noose goes over the cattle's head, it falls off their ear because the ear was, quote, slick. A tight dally and a loose latigo. You want to make sure your saddle is cinched on tightly because you don't want that saddle to shift on you when push comes to shove. Feel sorry for any cowboy whose latigo goes loose. Watch out for mother trying to protect her innocent babe. A moment of great peril. Here's another Charlie Russell original that I have in the exhibit. It was a dangerous career, a very dangerous career. Samuel Maverick was the origin of the idea of a maverick cow. He intentionally would not brand his cattle, so that became the universal name applied to cows without a brand. And of course, an unbranded cow was a temptation for rustlers. And here's a really cute picture that I have in the exhibit. This fancy lady is objecting to the cruelty of branding these poor animals, you know, burning their hides. And she says, why don't you do what the colleges do? The different colleges like Yale and Harvard, they have different colors. You could tie different color ribbons on their horns instead of branding them. The cook was of supreme importance. You had to have your men well fed. They don't want to work for an outfit that is skimping on the food. With the kind of work, the long hours and the danger they encountered, you wanted to be sure they were well fed. So the cook had this very, very important job. It was like their own little fiefdom. You didn't talk back to the cook. They had a job that was very demanding. They had to have really good food, potatoes, beans, bacon, fruit, rice, coffee, canned goods, fresh beef, wild game. They had to be very skilled at providing the best, even when it comes to, say, making pies. Can you imagine how good a pie would taste on a roundup? So, whether it was rain or shine, the people needed to eat. So, and they were very independent minded. You didn't, the trail boss and the owners, they had better be careful how they treated the cook. You have a cook that quits the job and walks off, your outfit's in trouble. And that was true on dude ranches too. I've studied dude ranches. I developed a dude ranching exhibit. And if the dude ranch cook walked off the job, you had a big problem on your hands. So criticizing the cook, no matter what you really thought of the wood, you kept your criticisms to yourself. The cook will tell you to go to hell and go eat somewhere else if you don't like my grub. Woe to that cowboy. Riding the range. Most of the cowboys were let off from the ranches in the wintertime because there wasn't too much to do. But some of them were hired to ride the range. They usually had line camps, little cabins out on the perimeter of their terrain. And a few cowboys were hired to go make circles called line riding out to the outlying camps to make sure that they kept an eye on the cattle. And Here is another one where some cowboys are bringing fresh meat to the men at the line camp. I believe I have that original in the, well, the original, not the original painting, the antique engraving of that was published. Primitive living, but they loved it. Drinking from a stream. Whoa. Oh. And it was a bachelor's life. What woman wants to be married to a cowboy who's on a trail drive or doing line riding? Usually, if you wanted a wife, you'd have to give up some of your cowboy ways and settle down. It was more of a bachelor's world. Just a little sunshine, just a little rain, just a little pleasure, just a little pain. I'll let you figure that out. Now, this is interesting that a lot of the historical record, when you get into the details, shows that there were a lot of African American cowboys. Not only that, but Hispanic cowboys. They estimate that up to a third of all the cowboys in the American West were non-whites, either African Americans or Hispanic origin. And they were, can you believe this photograph? Can you see, look at the African American cowboys in the middle drinking there with the whites. Try doing that in, say, an Eastern pub. No way. But out West, you know, if you can prove that you're a man who can do just as well as any other man in the outfit, then you're given some respect. And so there were African American cowboys were given respect that wasn't always allotted to other African Americans throughout the rest of our society. And in fact, there's some literature developed, and I have a copy up here of Black Cowboy History. I have 2 books on it, but I think I brought that, just one of the copies. They were very much there. So what was the big end of the tragedy of the Commons? It was dealt by Mother Nature in the winter of 1886 and 87. The cattle era boomed, but it also waned because as more and more cattle went up the trails, they ate more and more grass, and walking lowered their weight. You had to spend money on the provisions for the cowboy, et cetera, et cetera. So there were a lot of negatives. How can you blame Native Americans who were starving? The first decades or so on the reservations were very hard times. The buffalo were gone, and there was very little subsistence. So there was times when Native Americans would help themselves to an extra cow. And so that produced conflict that is illustrated here by Charlie Russell. Wolves were a big problem because there were literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of wolves feeding off of the bison herds. And they switched to the meat available, the cattle. And so the predation by wolves was very significant. So the cowboys always made war on wolves whenever they could, as shown by this Charlie Russell painting. Grizzly bears also bore the brunt of the cattleman's ire because grizzly bears will attack especially calves or sick cattle. So they made war on the bears. I love the title of this Russell picture, Loops and Swift Horses Are Surer Than Lead. And it was also, I considered it great sport and proof of their manhood, if you can rope some grizzlies. But again, you better make sure 2 or more of you are at the job. The Homestead Act was actually, we think of the Homestead era as the early 1900s, but when I delved into it, Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act in 1862, and it went into effect on January 1st, 1863. But in the West, the homesteaders in the beginning were filing homesteads along the banks of the streams where the water is. The water is critical, of course. And so this led to conflict as the homesteaders came and put up fences around their property, especially along water courses. This made the open range more difficult to maintain by the cattle outfits. So there was kind of a low-grade war between the cattle outfits and the homesteaders. As we know, eventually so-called law and order prevailed. Cattle rustling was also a big problem, as indicated here, that you could rework a brand from its original one to a different one and claim ownership. So cattle rustlers were often fair game for the ones in control. The famous Johnson County War. Don't want to get into the details of that, but if you're interested in a very large effort against cattle rustlers, you should read about the Johnson County War, not too many miles to the east of us here. I threw this in. This has a particular poignance to me. This is, by the way, how many have ever seen the movie Shane? It came out in, I believe, what, the 50s? Okay, I have a particular connection to it. You know, the story is about a homesteader who comes in and the cattlemen try to run him off because he's taking his range, and Shane comes along, you know, and kills the bad guys, and the homesteader wins. I have a particular fondness for this because Shane was filmed on my father's cousin's ranch in Teton Valley. Yep. But the blizzards, what really did in the free range and the cattle industry as it was booming. The blizzard of 1886 was unrelated. It was preceded by a drought, so very little grass grew in the summer of 1886, and then there were unrelenting blizzards, one after another in that winter. And this is the famous postcard that Charlie Russell painted. One of the cattle owners had written to Charlie Russell, wanted to know how his cattle had fared in the winter of 1886. And Charlie Russell painted that picture and sent just the picture to the owner, you know, giving them the idea, you know, skin and bones, about ready to die to the wolves. So the cowboy ethos, the cowboy was the product of primitive, chaotic, elemental forces, rough and barbarous and strong. Let's go to the last paragraph. Another and most notable of his characteristics is his entire devotion to the interests of his employer. Just think of it. The average cowboy did not own the cows, and yet he put his life on the line, life and limb on the line to serve his employer. They were about as faithful an employee as you could ever imagine, and they deserve a lot of your respect. You've seen now for the last hour the challenges that they faced to protect the interests of the owners of the cattle. So I've taken up an hour of your time, and I appreciate your patience. And apparently, a real cowboy always drinks Coca-Cola. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Questions, comments, stories?
Lee, can you share a bit of history on Gillette, Moorcroft, Miles City, cattle industry early on coming to the railroad?
I don't know much of the specifics about that. I know that in Miles City, they have a roundup. Remember the name of it? Nancy, help me. There's a annual event every... The Bucking Horse Stampede every May in Miles City. I believe that was the railhead at one time for the Northern Pacific Railroad. So it's where the cattle were driven, and that was the origin of it. But of course, the railroad continued on right after that. So it was just for a short period. But to honor the cowboy era, they have that Bucking Horse Stampede every day. I have not, every year. I have not attended it, but I don't know that much about it, so I can't give you a really good answer. I'm sorry.
So, Ben Jake worked for the 101 Ranch at Moorcroft, and he came up in Nebraska and worked for some ranches down south, southern part of Wyoming. But he worked 101 up here, and Moorcroft was the main necropolis in this area at that time. They shipped thousands and thousands of cattle out of Moorcroft, and But anyhow, he talked about, repping, and he'd be clear down by Edgemont, South Dakota, gathering 101 cattle.
Wow.
And so they would have their circle wagons, and they're the ones that were, made up of reps from different ranches. And so they're out there gathering, and they ride 15 miles away from the wagon in the morning before they ever started gathering.
Wow.
And they bring them in and they sort them. And so then they had spoke wagons that came out from Moorcroft or the ranch headquarters and with a crew, and they would gather up the cattle that had been sorted off with that brand and take them back to the headquarters or take them back to a shipping point.
Right.
And so that's how that all worked. But he talked about being up by Alzada, Montana, Edgemont, South Dakota. And then there's another book, Bob Fudge, he came up with XIT. And anyhow, he wound up staying up here, and his range was between the Yellowstone. He said a lot of times he was up in Canada getting cattle for the XIT.
Wow.
And bringing them back to the home range, which was between the Missouri and the Yellowstone.
So they had to have crossed the river.
Yep, they swam them.
Swam the river. So from your experience and what you know, what was like the maximum distance some of these cattle could have drifted from their home range?
I mean, you don't have any fences, and so
Right.
you're talking hundreds of miles.
Wow.
These cattle would graze away from where their home range was at, because they're going wherever there's grass. Sometimes a storm will push cattle in a direction, they drift with the storm and the winds.
Right.
And so when they quit, then them cattle are in that area for a time.
Mm-hmm.
And anyhow,
Yeah.
it's real interesting because them guys are tough. And Bob Fudge swam the Yellowstone midwinter, and because he was a dark complected guy, probably had African American in him, and but the guy that had a ferry, and this is down there by close to Terry, Montana, and anyhow, he didn't like Bob because of his color, and Bob needed to get across the river to get some supplies and for his line shack, and this guy says, "I ain't hauling your black butt across there." And so anyhow, Bob says, "Fine." He goes down the river a ways and breaks the ice on the edge of the river, swims the Yellowstone over to Terry, and gets himself warmed up right off, and goes and buys these provisions, and then he pays a guy to take these provisions and across the ferry for him. And then Bob goes back down, swims back across the river, back to his line shack.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
He's a tough guy.
I'll say, I was backpacking in the Wind River Range, and we had to ford a stream about as wide as from the wagon to the wall there. And it was 32.1 degrees. And by the time I got to the other side, I could not feel my feet. And the idea of riding across the Yellowstone River in the middle of winter sounds horrific.
When I was working for interior decorator when I first came to Gillette, we went out to the headquarters of the T7 Ranch. I don't know if it's even still in existence because it was about in the north end of the mining area. And they had a picture on the wall of 100 horses and riders. And the person there said that they tried to control about like from Highway 59 to the South Dakota line to the Montana state line.
Wow.
And that house had a log cabin inside of it, all walled up and built around. And there was walls there that were plastered that were probably 2 foot thick. But they built a bigger house around the log cabin.
Original
I found
one.
that extremely interesting.
Hmm.
So this rock pile out here, for your information, is a
Mhm.
landmark for cattle herds and sheep
Oh,
herds
yeah.
coming to, railroad, um, stockyards down here. And because they were right just down over the hill, and the Burlington Northern Ditch runs across, just underneath the base of the hill here, and that's what supplies water out of Donkey Creek into, Burlington Lake over here, for, not only for the cattle, but for the railroad to have water for the steam engines. And when I was a kid, my dad was a ranch manager for a pretty large outfit north of here, but halfway between here and Brazos, Montana. And at that time, we hired Bell and Mooney to haul our shipper cattle from the ranch, which was 45 miles out, haul them into Gillette, and they would be loaded on the railroad and shipped to Omaha. And the last load of cattle that we shipped out of here on the railroad to go to Omaha, beginning, the railroad would spot the cars and load the cattle. Then they got so they'd spot the cars, but you had to load the cattle. And the last year we shipped out, my dad and I had to spot our own cars and load our own cattle. And they sat on a siding between here and Nebraska somewhere for 14 hours, no water, no feed.
Mm.
And then, so that's the last time we ever shipped Omaha.
Yeah, I've been, people have asked me, how did the Rockpile Museum get their name? And I just learned that today. It was the landmark that people used to come from a long distance, because you could see that from many different places. So
And
it
you'd
was,
be surprised how many people say, well, that pile of rock was made there, and it wasn't.
it's natural, isn't it?
And-
Yeah.
and
So
that's
how many miles away can you see the rock pile from? Well, I mean, back in the original days, 40, 50 miles maybe? Get on a higher butte and you can see it.
So was it Johnson County cattle wars, cattle ranchers against rustlers, or was it cattlemen against sheepmen?
It was her.
Cattlemen against the homesteaders.
It was against the homesteaders, who they were accusing of being cattle rustlers. Yeah, it was a very complex situation. There was a lot of legal maneuvering afterwards. It's quite a story. I really don't know that much about it. I've read like one book, and but it's a fairly sad affair. There were people that died in it on both sides of the event. Fortunately, it wasn't repeated very much. Yes.
I noticed in one of your pictures they were using dogs. Was it common to have dogs to help with their cattle herds?
Whoa.
There's a question.
I don't know the answer to that. I know dogs were very prevalent with sheep herders.
I knew that.
Yeah. I kind of think not so much, but I don't know, maybe some of the people in the audience can answer that.
I've never read any books where dogs were used
Yeah.
for moving cattle, back in the day.
Yeah,
Maybe they rode through a homesteader's place and the dog took.
Yeah, I
know
would-
they use them now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But-
We used to.
Use them up?
That was that long.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right,
Thank
anything
you.
else? Well, thank you, Lee, very much.
My pleasure.
Give another round of applause.
All right, thank you again for coming. Enjoy the exhibits.
Come and
Check
get
out
a
the books.
book, get a bibliography, and
Have a good evening.
thank you very much. Have some more food.
About your brother?